welcome back to the Edtech podcast. I'm your host, Philippa. Today's episode will start with our news update, the AI paradox in global education and the workforce. The latest global evidence is sharpening a single challenge for education systems. Can schools and universities become the mechanism that turns AI into a lever rather than a divider? Several major reports recently are pointing to the same risk. The AI is accelerating fast, but access, skills and safeguards are not keeping pace, meaning the benefits could concentrate in high-income countries and among already advantaged learners. The World Trade Organization, in its World Trade Report 2025, says that AI could boost global trade by nearly 40% by 2040, but only if policy and technology gaps are bridged. Otherwise, low-income countries may miss the upside. The United Nations Development Programme warns that AI could trigger the next great divergence between countries if readiness and adoption remain unequal. And with AI use far higher in high-income economies and still very low in many low-income contexts, this could be a problem. With Microsoft's AI diffusion report covered widely in October 2025, it argues that AI is spreading faster than previous technologies like electricity or the internet. Yet large parts of the world still lack the infrastructure and skills to participate meaningfully. And the OECD's Trees report, although quite some time ago, states that is educating losing the race with technology. It highlights the importance of a tough implication for workforce readiness, which is still so relevant today in core areas like literacy and numeracy. Many adult skill levels are still close to what AI systems can already perform. This is raising the bar for what education must now deliver. And so what does that mean for education institutes? It suggests that the education response is no longer just about digital devices or curriculum add-ons, but is about three urgent roles: building practical AI literacy, hands-on job-relevant use, not theory or specialist degrees, so learners can work and use AI to augment their own human capability. It's about protecting learners with clear boundaries on privacy, safety, and high-risk uses, with things like the EU AI Act often referenced as the most developed model for guardrails. And number 3 is to close the access gap by treating connectivity, computing capacity, and teaching capability as economic infrastructure, not as optional edtech. So if AI is moving faster than education systems can reform, what's the one change educational leaders, governments should now prioritise? Universal AI literacy, teacher workload reduction, or national safety frameworks to stop this becoming a permanent global divide. Some conversations make you pause. Others make you rethink what you thought you knew. Today's episode is much the latter. I'm Philippa, your host of the Edtech podcast, and today I'm joined by Al Kingsley, a long-standing voice in global edtech governance, system leadership, and wears many hats: CEO, chair of multiple trusts, advisor to governments, author, and, as he so perfectly describes himself, an edgy edtech magpie, constantly spotting the great work and sharing it generously with the wider community. In this conversation, we explore everything from what actually makes a good school to why curiosity matters more than conformity. How Al is forcing us to rethink assessment and why digital, when done well, is fundamentally about equity, accessibility, and human flourishing. This is a thoughtful, honest, and occasionally uncomfortable conversation in the best way. So let's get right into it with one of my favourite friends, Al Kingsley. Hello and welcome, Al Kingsley, to the Edtech podcast. For those listeners globally, although I'm sure there aren't many, who don't know who you are, please would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, hello. I can make things up at this point, couldn't I? I'm a world-famous astronaut. Many of you will know. No, I'm not really. So I wear a few hats, and I like that, which is also a reflection on my inability to say no to people. I've spent the last 35 years in educational technology, Edtech CEO at NetSupport. I've spent over 20 years in governance and supporting system growth and school leadership. So I chair a multi-academy trust, a couple at the moment actually. I have a role with the DfE for the last 6 years, supporting the system in the east of England, chair SEND boards. Back on my EdTech hat, I chair the BISA EdTech Special Interest Group, supporting all the EdTech companies in the UK. And I think I've reached a point where I'm a bit of an edu magpie. I love to see around the world cool stuff happening and try and share it with other folks across the education sector.
That is brilliant. I love that, the Edtech magpie. And I think I know, for instance, one of my favourite points of the week is your newsletter, because it feels so full of an abundance of information and insights and support. And I know that I very much personally feel that you're a very supportive person within the EdTech community. And I know also a lot of other EdTechers feel the same. Is that something that you feel has been done because it's just genuinely something that you want to do, or is it for other reasons as well?
Well, I think there's definitely an element of when you've been involved in the space for a long, long time, it's very easy to just sort of think you're at that point where you've got your experience and you can talk about it. And so for me, the catalyst for doing a newsletter is to keep me current, to force me to read and for me to learn, because I think there's way too many people talking with a perspective. And that perspective for me feels many years out of date and not really resonating with what's happening right now. There is a second bit, which is, and I have to be careful because maybe I can class myself as being that. There are familiar voices that we often hear in the space talking about things. And I do feel in the spirit of that social media echo chamber, in an EdTech and education echo chamber, it's really important that we hear other people's voices too. And there's amazing folks doing cool stuff that many of us have not discovered yet or come across yet on our paths. And so I kind of go out of my way to read and discover new folks doing amazing stuff in schools somewhere on the planet in different ways and try and capture that and signpost them to others, which I suppose comes back full circle to that kind of, we all stand on the shoulders of others. I think it's incumbent on us all to reach a point where we're able and we're invited to come into the room and share things to make sure that we mention folks who aren't in the room at the same time.
And that, I think, is something that makes the work that you do very special. I guess it's also what links you into being able to support things like multi-academy trusts. But a question to you would be, where did it all begin? What was your first role and how did it get you to where you are today?
Well, if you see photos of me as a 3-4-year-old, you'll see that I was a very early stage style icon, model, a number of different areas. I had knees my mother would say to die for. I think it's important just to put that out there for listeners. Obviously, more of a face for radio than TV, but there's a different story.
Photos in the show notes.
Serious answer is, of course, is that, I left school and I was going on my journey. We lived in Cambridge at the time and I was thinking about what's my career, my calling. And I guess like many of us, often it's not your first stop that is your final destination. And my parents told me, if you want to be successful in life, join a bank, be a banker. They make lots of money and they're highly regarded and respected. So I joined Barclays Bank. Hallelujah, my career is sorted. And I very quickly realized that in a bank, nobody wants your opinion on how you can do things better, differently, because we've done it that way for 100 years, young Mr. Kingsley, and that's the way we'll continue to do it. So get your pen and fill out that paperwork in the same way. Yeah, but if we just change this form, we'd save a load of time. Doesn't matter. We're not intending to do that. So I very quickly got bored of that. And realized it was not my calling. So I stepped away from a bank and I worked for Unilever doing finance, surprisingly. But I also was there at the advent of computers, when computers were at that time a room of which lots of things happened and a small little bit of data punched out. And we suddenly were just moving to desktop computing. This, for those listening on a timeline, is the early mid-80s. And that was my kind of point. And I found the computers far more interesting. So, of course, I told my boss that I felt that computers was a far better pathway than corporate finance. And they looked at me and they laughed slightly and said, Kingsley, do you understand it's a few little geeky people that do computing, whereas corporate finance is your career to riches and success. And I kind of said, well, that's what I want to do. And I left again. And I ended up supporting smaller companies who wanted to do their IT, and I did their accounts for them at the same time. So it was my way to get into something while still paying the bills. And then very quickly got into the, how can I do more technology? Technology became meeting somebody who was developing a remote control product. Again, simply how do I connect to a computer somewhere else if you're not in the room? Using a modem. So very slow way where you just sat screechy for a while before you could connect. And the story went on. So that was my entry into technology. And then, of course, I had children. And my children meant that suddenly I was very aware of what was happening in the world of technology. I moved to the United States and lived there for 4 years, picked Atlanta. Atlanta was picked simply because it was the home of Delta Airlines and I could commute. And I spent my days flying out on a Monday and visiting school districts all around America and working with them because they had geography. So they wanted to connect teachers and students and learners and systems, but also needed the spirit of how do I use that technology to keep our learners safe. And of course, if you can connect to one computer 100 miles away, it's quite a leap, but quite an easy leap to say, why don't I connect to 30 computers that are really close by, like 2 meters away, so that I can see what children are doing, I can interact, instruct, or whatever. My passion suddenly realized, a bit like my computing journey, that I actually found the education bit more interesting than the technology. So what do you do in business? Well, you make sure you recruit good people to do the work and then you follow your passion. So I came back to the UK, settled in Peterborough. I was asked to join the governing body of Hampton College, a brand new secondary school being built. Became the chair of governors, said, I know, let's bid to become a multi-academy trust and then we'll bid to open another secondary school. And we did, and we were successful. And then we bid to build a primary and then another primary. And then I was asked to join an infant school who were in a difficult place. And we need to find a home for them. So they joined Hampton too. And I've continued on that journey, working and supporting and getting involved. And then my passion took me down a whole path, Philippa, of how can we help those children, whether it's from an SEN perspective or just frankly from an equalities and accessibility perspective. And now I spend most of my time in schools and a little bit of my time doing grown-up work that's paid because it's what I enjoy. And I'm very fortunate to be able to kind of do that all around the world and just kind of absorb and be that edu magpie.
I absolutely love that. I had no idea that you lived in the US and what a journey as well. And I think such an amazing way to build up those insights and that journey and that pathway to get to where you are today. Because I do honestly believe that the products that I see, the tech tools that I see have come from people who have seen that need and understand it. And I guess that's a little bit where Net Support has been developed and grown and nurtured from, would be that idea of this connection and the idea of safety and supporting every single person to make sure that they are not able to just use technology, but actually use it in a really safe, secure and purposeful manner, right?
I love that. I mean, yes, co-production is king. Always has been, always will be. If you think you know best, you might as well quit. So understanding what people need, not trying to create something and tell people what they need is absolutely key. But also recognizing that we all work in schools in different ways and different roles. But a school in the east of England versus a school in Atlanta versus a school in New York versus a school in South America, they look the same on the outside, but there are different nuances, different needs, different requirements. We developed mass notification technology for the US because of school shootings and other means of doing things that were about how do we react to situations. In some schools, you know, there's for many years, and I know you'll have seen it on your journey with digital and that evolving digital ecosystem, to use a well-known book's title, there has been this kind of arms race that the best products are the ones that have the most features. And this year we add more features and more features. And suddenly, hallelujah, I think maybe the pandemic was a little bit of that kind of switchover point. There's been an understanding that actually the best tools are the ones that are most accessible, easiest to use, platform agnostic, scalable, secure. And it isn't about we want 1,000 features we're never going to use. We want the features we actually need, and we're going to want to make sure that all of our learners or staff can use them purposefully. So there's a kind of a reset. And if you suddenly think, well, the best product isn't the one with the most features, the most tools, how do you make the best product? And the answer has to be you have to have a deep understanding of what the customer, the school, the leader, the educators need. That's the only way to achieve the best product. Then you have to make sure it actually does what it says on the tin and it works consistently. But first and foremost, you have no choice but to research and understand. I used to call myself a lifelong learner. Now I'm just naturally curious. I think curious is a better term. I want that to be the inspiration for learners. So lots of my writing, research, working with people like the Fed and the OECD is that natural curiosity of actually paring back to what does good look like? What does that mean in the context of technology, but an education system, a school, a lesson? You know, that kind of sparks that constant curiosity that sometimes gets me to going down way too many rabbit holes. But we have to have a passion, otherwise why get up in the morning?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think over the last 2 years, one of the things that I've realised the most is that I just love what I do. And again, like you said, I feel really lucky in that. And And I guess that brings me to, one of the things that you've just sort of alluded to slightly there is your books, because it takes a lot to write a book, and you haven't just written one, you've written several. So where did that passion come from, and what kind of started that off, and what kick-started that? And then tell us a little bit more about the most recent.
Well, I suppose the first one was for the wrong reasons in a sense, because I think probably like most folks, my natural assumption was I could never write a book, nor would anybody be interested in what I had to say. And so the very first book, which was my secret Edtech diary, and if you're old enough listening, that was my ode to Adrian Mole and his secret diary, was something that I was encouraged to do because it was a really good way of, from a publicity and engagement point of view, giving something to say to people, read that, and then let's have a conversation. A bit of a calling card. But I wanted to write something as if we were sat in a coffee shop having a chat. So it was very much that. Let me talk you through my journey in EdTech and then the things to think about moving forwards. But then you follow your passions, don't you? So having done an EdTech diary, I then thought, well, I'm going to have to now do my governance handbook. And having done a diary and a handbook, I needed to do a school and multi-academy trust growth guide. I hadn't done a guide yet. So I'm going through this handbook, guide, so the different terminologies. And then I created I took a bit of a detour, created a light one, which is like 100 questions that you could be asking in terms of system, leadership, governance, and so on. And I did most of my books with John Catt, Shet Publications, and then took a detour and wanted to write something a bit more meaty, which is my latest tome, which is the awkward questions in education. And so I've done that with David Fulton, Routledge. So that was a much bigger year-long project of research. And it's all those conversations that we're a little bit uncomfortable talking about. So the first one, not surprisingly, I guess, what makes a good school, and if you to sit down and say, Al, I'm here in the UK at the moment. I'd love to come to your schools in Peterborough. Tell me what makes a good school. I promise you nothing I share that I'm proud about or good in my schools will be the same wordage you'd find on our Ofsted inspection report. And so that understanding of what we look for in a good school and what we're trying to achieve, I think is really important, because unless you know what you're trying to aim for, what one looks like, and we're quite good in education. We're all good at doing a waggle. But then when it comes to our actual schools, well, hang on a second, that feels a bit uncomfortable. And then there's the whole thing about, well, is our curriculum fit for purpose? And given the advent of AI and with the best will in the world, computers can do maths better than the best mathematician and can translate languages quicker than the best linguist. Don't skills have slightly more value now than they did a few years ago? And aren't employers predominantly looking for people with skills? So if skills are more valued, why hasn't the curriculum adapted to reflect that? Hang on a second. Oh, yeah, but in the advent of AI, we don't need to do reading and writing. We just get computers to do it. And then you have to go full circle and say, you know what, the number one skill that you need to use AI, large language models, purposefully is the ability to read and write. That's your entry. That's your front door into it. And then if you do that and you listen, perhaps oracy needs to be escalated in what we talk about. And so all these things flip on to skills versus the curriculum. Does AI change the role of the teachers? What's about our system growth? Is the future going to be in the classroom or hybrid or entirely virtual? And if our biggest problems are children's mental health, social SEMH, attendance, and all these things, and about this lack of agency because kids don't often see the curriculum reflects any purpose. There's no why behind what they're learning versus what they think they need. How do they all fit into what does the future landscape look like? And so I often kind of say to folks, well, if somebody gave me the power of God, Philippa, for the day, and that in itself, if I'm thinking that way, I probably need to go see a therapist myself. But if I had the power of God to start with a blank planet Earth education system, I wouldn't start with bricks and mortars. I'd start on day one by putting a device in the hand of every child, giving them all equitable access to high quality education. And then I would build loads of places and spaces so they could develop that social emotional, that interpersonal, the relationships that are absolutely fundamental. But, the geography of many countries around the world says you can't possibly build a high quality school within driving distance of every child on the planet. So you've got to think differently. Certainly here in the UK, and we have the same challenge in the US, 20-30% of young people have a real disconnect with the education system now. Many are around anxiety and other factors. Some are around the system. So we can't keep kidding ourselves that if we just keep waving a bigger and bigger stick, we'll force them to suffer 12 years of education before they leave at the other end. To me, that's kind of pointless exercise.
Teachers, have you heard of Bett UK 2026? Well, today's episode is sponsored by them. It's the world's biggest education and technology event, and it's completely free for educators. From keynote speakers and panel discussions to CPD accredited workshops and networking. Bett UK 2026 is where educators from across the globe come together to share ideas, spark inspiration, and find solutions that drive our mission to drive a better education globally. Get your free ticket today at bettshow.com. All the information is in the show notes. I think it feels very similar in some ways, the work that you've been doing with your books and also the work that you do every day with all sorts of different companies and schools across the world. But to that conversation with Barclays Bank about things are not going to change. And these feel like a little bit of a nod to they could if we work together to do that. Do you think there's a...
I think so. I mean, maybe there's a degree of we have to be mindful of thinking that we're more influential than we are, and we know in education the challenge is it is an oil tanker moment. I spent 2 years co-chairing a work stream with the Foundation for Education Development and the OECD with Michael Stevenson, working on their project for promoting human flourishing. And that was a shift from the PISA rankings, which I've always felt have just been a politician's reason to say we're good, aren't we, versus anything meaningful. But to change that idea that a child leaves at 16 from a school, I'll use it for example, when I look at their the PISA rankings as 15-year-olds, we hold up and say Singapore's the most amazing school system, versus perhaps there are children leaving that classroom and that regimented learning for 10, 12 years who are like, hell no, never again am I setting foot in a learning environment, versus a child that comes out of a different education system but doesn't get lauded as the most high performing, but has an absolute curiosity, passion and lifelong love of learning. And so human flourishing is about how do we instill a sense of passion about learning, curiosity, a sense of awe and wonder, appreciate of the arts and the broader curriculum, and that more sustainability, and it links into skills and those other bits and pieces. So all that comes full circle to where are our governments going to have the courage as individuals to say, rather than just tinkering at the edges of our curriculum and our school systems within an electoral cycle where we can get the win before the next round of votes come out saying, look at me, aren't I amazing as the new Secretary of State for Education, we did this. And say, actually, we need a system reform, which might take 10 or 15 years, which means it shouldn't be a political conversation. It needs to be something that we're all joined up with on a strategic basis. And many countries around the world are grappling with that at the moment. And maybe we hold up a few like Estonia and we go, there's a good example for you. Well, there is, yes, but Estonia had a fairly good catalyst, which is they separated from the Soviet Union and had to start again with their curriculum and their learning resources, which were very Russian-centric. So we don't have that same catalyst here. We have to think of different ways to how to instill it. You either turn around and say, well, it'll never happen. It's all on politicians. And if we trust politicians to do anything, well, we're all doomed. Or we say, actually, most things happen by us within the system coming together, and over time, there's a groundswell of understanding. Or sometimes people develop ways of developing the education system in spite of system leaders. People come together and they share best practice. The thing that you do so fantastically with podcasts and other resources in terms of just building that network for professional development, that actually that allows folks to develop and say, I'm not alone. Others are thinking the same way as me. Let's start sharing resources. Let's come together and find ways that we can support ourselves so that we can challenge the system or we can adapt for our learners in spite of the system. And so I do think there is that bit again where if you've been in the system long enough, I do think it's incumbent on us where we have a platform or we have an opportunity to be heard slightly more, that we don't just waste it by just waving and smiling at the camera and actually challenge and be the, not the grumpy one, but the one that's willing to say, hang on a minute, I need to ask some awkward questions and you need to answer them.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as well, because you mentioned things like Estonia and that kind of clean slate. I'm working a lot with what people class as new and emerging countries. And it is really interesting, that ability just to go from the beginning and the ground up. With all that in mind, in terms of, people sort of questioning it, there are things like online schools coming out, and there's lots of different people who are starting to work on that side of things. Now, I'm aware that obviously as multi-academy trusts, we have certain elements like pupil referral units. I don't think they're called that any longer in the UK, but different alternative provisions for students. How do you see the future of that changing? How do you see the future of maybe online schooling being able to be a little bit more adaptable to the masses, perhaps?
So I wear a few hats that help on this conversation. So I was asked after a rather disappointing Ofsted inspection of a pupil referral unit in Peterborough as part of the city's only alternative provision to step in as their chair and find them a new home. So I found a home in a multi-academy trust. The alternative provision became the Richard Barnes Academy. And after 2 or 3 years, we got our Ofsted good and have been moving on since then. And the important thing was there were a lot of young people there where the biggest challenge was actually getting them in the front door consistently. Sometimes because of anxiety, sometimes because they'd almost given up on themselves because they couldn't possibly achieve within the curriculum boundaries. They'd been told they were a failure consistently in mainstream settings. And sadly, for some that were older, there were more shiny opportunities to earn money, whether it was county lines or other activities outside of school. And what we did find was certain ways of looking at technology. So when the pandemic came along and it was online learning and it was engaging in different ways, we had higher attendance rates of our learners than getting them through the threshold of school. For some, when we said, let's use digital technology to talk about what you know and create a different way of doing it, we found higher engagement. If I sat down with somebody who was given a pen and paper and said, tell us to answer this question and write an essay on 10, 15 minutes, and the focus and attention was waning, and I don't see the point of this, and I'm going to kick off because that's a way for me to basically step away from the pressure of actually delivering on something. And we actually said, well, let's just talk and record it. Give me an audio summary of what you know. Their understanding was far greater. And so it was a case of let's not set people up for failure. Let's set them up for success. And so we've seen alternative provision becoming something where historically the mindset's been we put a child in AP and they stay there until they leave the education system. Whereas the best outcome is always a child goes into AP, gets the wraparound support and care that they need for a period of time, 3, 4, 5 months at max. And then they go back into the mainstream setting with the right toolkit and also with the right additional support to mean that they can be sustained and supported in mainstream education in most cases. And I think if we look at that toolkit of our standard education system, I wear another hat. I sit on the advisory board at Minerva Education, UK's fastest growing online school. There's some really great ones. There's Sophia as well. There's some really good schools in the UK and elsewhere that are now popping up. I think the mindset of the education system is one size fits all. The box has been open and we know that that's no longer a reality. For 60% of children, mainstream traditional education coming into school 5 days a week works well. It's a good blend between that academic learning and building and developing relationships and all the extracurricular activity that benefits them. And for a smaller minority, there is absolutely a value in a full virtual education, although clearly a virtual education comes at the loss of many of those interpersonal things, which is why some of the best offerings now provide those snapshots monthly to get together in a physical sense with their peers. I think that argument stands better for secondary. I'm not so convinced that primary yet, but that's the case. A hybrid, I think, is definitely a journey that we're seeing. There's a move towards in terms of providing that access to learning for those young people that are anxious or struggling with the mainstream education, but finding a safe compromise. And again, I think if we think about around the world developing high-performing school systems, if you have a limiting, let's roll the clock forward 5 years, shall we? Biggest pressures, recruitment and retention of educators, certainly retention of system leaders. Well, if you've got less and less high-quality experienced teachers, how do you flex your system? Well, you have a hybrid offer where your children spend 2-3 days a week in school and 2 days out, and you're able to extend your role from 1,000 to 2,000 learners, and you're able to have a fluidity that means that we can continue to offer that high-performing education. In an ideal world, we find a space where every learner can come into school 5 days a week. But then we also need to remember that that traditional model of a classroom that just about fits 30 children and has a couple of windows and some poor ventilation, it's not the way that we find a space that we want our learners to sit in for 5 days a week. I think our staff will give you a fairly good summary of why that's not the best for their well-being, their mental health, or anything else, frankly. And so it's like, well, have we looked elsewhere to see about more fluid learning spaces? I mean, it is funny, and you can just tell me, Al, shut up at any point when I'm on my rant. But we start our education journey in early years foundation space where we do play-based learning and we have this massive curiosity. And by year 2, we've knocked that curiosity out of everybody and said, you just make sure you sit on that marker on that mat and you do as you're told and we'll tell you when you can do this, that and the other. And it's like, what we learn by playing, by exploring, by trying, and by failing. At what point did we suddenly make it a bad thing to do that, and we need to stick with the conformity? There is clearly, there's a balance here. We can't just have everybody doing free form till they're 18. That would be an interesting education system. But there's also a reflection of, have we got the balance right? Because last time I checked, what we do in our schools fundamentally is no different to 1870 in the Education Reform Act, where we said we just want to make sure we can pick up a child from any school within the British Empire and they'll have sufficient literacy and numeracy that they can be productive in the workplace anywhere we drop them. And nobody really thought about, is that the most important stuff?
That's really interesting. When I was doing some work for National College quite a while ago, actually now on STEAM, I did the history of it. And actually it was very much a war-based thing that instead of going out and learning about agriculture or learning about your, potentially your family business, it became this element of everybody goes to school because we now need you to be able to work and understand and rebuild the system. And that was a real catalyst for this change in education, which hasn't really changed from the rows and rows of people.
The
right?
universities are guilty too. It's the university system that says we need to find a way to have a measurement of who's allowed in the front door to come and study at university. We need to provide a value to having a degree. So we create a threshold that makes sure that only a certain percentage are likely to get past that threshold. And that gives us the value of our university. So they were the creations of the A levels. And then we go back to our, what were O levels, GCSEs. And then we look at our GCSEs. And I appreciate with different listeners around the world be saying, that familiar for me, but our measure for our 16-year-olds in the UK and often around the world, or our IGCSEs and so on. But there's a system there that says everybody take the exam and everybody gets marked. And then when you've all been marked, we'll decide at that point afterwards where the pass mark is. And miraculously, based on that norm referencing, every year, 40% of children fail. Now, I was at the British Council recently. They asked me to provide a plenary at the end of their assessment conference. So I had all the exam boards from around the world, and I just showed a picture of my 10-meter swimming badge, which I'm very proud of as a child. It was very, very proud on my swimming trunks. And I just said, imagine if my 10-meter swimming test was like GCSEs and we set it up so that 40% of the children drowned. What we'd be doing at the swimming pool was we'd be saying that 10-meter, there's too many getting to the other side. Let's make it a 12-meter badge, a 14-meter badge, a 15-meter badge. But in essence, that's exactly what we've done. We've said we can't possibly have a GCSE where everybody passes. That wouldn't make it valuable. We have to make sure sufficient fail to make it credible. What a daft system to say, if this year we've got a really academic cohort, why can't they all pass? If you achieve the right gradings, why shouldn't you? And at the same time, we also say, what's the barriers to us saying, well, based on our generations of learners, why couldn't they do some more of their exams digitally? Why couldn't they scale? And the answer isn't because it wouldn't be a fair representation or assessment. It's because we haven't got enough technology in most of the school systems to consistently provide access for all our learners. Because if we did do it digitally and we could mark it automatically, then the exam boards wouldn't have to charge the average secondary school £150,000 a year for their exam fees. And if you multiply that across all the schools in England, you'd pretty much wipe out the financial deficit that all of our schools have got. So we are challenging the education system and the exam boards and the assessment process in a different way. And they were very proud. They've made about 15 different changes in the last 5 years to our exams, but all of them were on legal requirements for adjustments, appropriate adjustments for learners based on particular needs. But we're not choosing to change the fundamentals of assessment because A, the system makes much money out of it, and B, we're still looking backwards and saying the best test is what you can remember over the last 3 years. Why don't we trust the educator, whether it's the teacher-led or the centre-led assessment of a child's understanding over a duration? We'd probably get, as we did during the pandemic, a much better reflection of a child's understanding.
So amazing to hear you put it in that way. It was quite, almost took me back a little bit, because that is quite a horrifying image, really, isn't it? Of not letting people get past. So what do? Well, we almost let them drown. And that really is what we're doing to children's confidence and to their own, ability in themselves, is to think, oh, well, I didn't do well enough. And so now I'm not going to be able to do well enough. I mean, I know so many people who failed, let's say, in terms of those kind of words, who are now the most incredible business people, the most incredible minds, the most brilliant entrepreneurs, and the most creative people. But because they didn't fit into those boundaries. And I also very kind of in my head kind of went off on a little tangent and wondered if that was where they brought in the pajamas that you had to then wear to see if you could pass that test. And maybe that was where everybody started to
the
fail.
irony is, this whole AI conversation, which we can all be very passionate about, AI is a catalyst. We can say AI has arrived. It's a catalyst to rethink what we're doing in education. So let's just park AI away now. What was the catalyst that's changed? If you walk into a workplace and you're recruiting, we want people now because we've got the technology, we've got the AI agents, and we've got our systems that are developing. But we say we're recruiting people that have got communication skills, collaboration skills, innovation, creativity, imagination, resilience, all those human soft skills that are now the power skills. So if what employer wants are people with the human skills, because AI is replacing many of the most academic roles in terms of its capabilities, then we've just flipped the education system on its head, because we've said the highest value is not having a degree or not having a specialism. And there's a caveat here. I think I'd like my doctor to still have studied medicine as a topic. In the broader sense, we've now flipped it so that when you're a child, that you're not the most academic in the traditional sense. You probably have the skills that employers want most. So we've kind of removed the glass ceiling by saying, actually, this is not a race. And I often use a Chinese proverb, which is a stumbling bird can reach the forest first. And that normally causes people to think he's completely lost his marble. I don't know why he's just shared that. But it's the culture difference between, in a broader sense, the East and the West. So in the West, we tend to have an assumption that the most academic child will be the most successful in life. They'll get the most qualifications, get the best paid jobs. And if they've got the best paid jobs, they're happy, right? And in the East, there's generally a mindset of it's about who works hardest. We put in extra lessons, extra tutoring, extra work, and we'll finally get to the point where by working really hard, we'll get the most amazing job that will be right for us and our family. And of course, I exaggerate for effect for both sides of that. So the mindset is the stumbling bird may not be the fastest fly, but if it works hard, it can get to the forest first. It can beat the fastest one. And that's very much that mindset now when it comes to the advent of AI has changed our mindset that the most academic children won't necessarily be the most successful. There are no glass ceilings now. If you've got great creativity and imagination and innovation, then those human traits are what employers will be looking for just as much as your numeracy and literacy. Ideally, you'll have the full bag. But isn't it interesting that if you go to your very highest qualifications that you can achieve, so in academia, we'd say probably a PhD, Dr. Al. Imagine that. That would be not happening. But I'd spend years writing an essay, and then they'd say, how are we going to prove that Al knows his stuff? Oh, I know. We'll sit him down with a panel. We'll do a Viva, and we'll have a panel of experts who will interview Al before he passes his PhD. So our way of proving your knowledge is to sit down and talk to you. And then we work all the way back from our master's to our degree, all done on the basis that you write essays and take sport tests and do other things, and your score is the sum of all of them. And we get back to A-level and GCSE and we go, oh, no, you've got to remember it all. It's a one-off test. With AI, how are we going to do assessment in school? Going to talk to your students more? Maybe ask them different questions? Maybe problem-based, project-based learning? And it's like, we just don't seem to be able to connect the dots as we go back further to say, this is what we want. And yet all the time in the workplace, Al will say, I need to get a promotion in my job and I need to learn a new skill. I'm going to go online. I'm going to sign up to a 3-month online course. I'm going to do it digitally. I'm going to get my certificate, my micro credential, and my employer will go, oh, well done, Al. You've now qualified in second tier programming. I'm going to give you a promotion and I'm going to give you an extra £3,000 a year salary. Well, now that micro-credential is worth far more to me than those other things. So how long before our children in schools, whether it's in state schools or international schools, get the choice to say, would you like to do an IGCSE in economics, or would you like to do a micro-credential in second-tier agentic programming? And what will be more important? Will it be something you do in the classroom, or will it be something you sign up to and do online, whether it's at home or in school? And will that qualification ultimately unlock more doors for you?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things to kind of bring in there as well, though, is the mindset of parents, because we grew up in it and not everyone thinks like you and I do. When my son was choosing his GCSE options last year, I was very adamant that he chose what he wanted. And there was not a question of, I want you to do this because it's not my choice. I don't have to do it for 2 years. And equally in that whole sense of also when you then do your A-levels, if that's what you choose to do, once you've got your A-levels, no one will ask you what your GCSEs were. They just want to know that you passed. And so that really important narrative, especially now with the incumbents of AI coming in so prolifically, and that importance of human connection, the ability to have conversations, to have your own opinion, these subjects where like economics or religious studies and things like that, where it's actually debate based, really conversational and really drawing out your opinion. What do you think? What do you believe when you compare these things and saying all those things? But there are so many conversations that I have either in my professional or personal life with parents who strongly still believe that they need to have the right subjects at GCSE, the right subjects at A-level. And also very traditionally, but they didn't get, 100% or they didn't get 90% and they must be failing and da, 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 da. And actually that whole narrative just doesn't feel like it's changing quickly enough, because that really as well is a support catalyst for students and children to be able to go, actually, I can. So many of my son's friends are saying now, well, I don't want to go to university. What's the point? And
Sounds
that's
like they've gone
happening a
full
lot.
circle to my mum saying you should go into banking as your first career out. I mean, you're right. We have sussed that actually the things you perform best at are the things that you have most interest in. So choosing the subjects it's not a surprise that we often see subjects that aren't taught pre-GCSE that become really popular, the sociologies and others, because often learners just want to do something new that will engage them and challenge them. I suppose it's probably not that long ago when we said the word apprenticeship, parents would say, oh no, that's a plumber, that's a carpenter, that's a trade. Well, some of the highest paid jobs now, mind you. But now when we say apprenticeship, you can be doing degree level apprenticeships in computer programming, accounting, finance, and all sorts of different things. So parents often are a barrier. I also think there's a continued mindset of we've got to pick carefully because it will dictate our job. Whereas now there's a recognition that most people will take many hops in their career to find the thing that they're most happy with. And often we see people retraining in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s to follow that passion. And I think that's another bit where the landscape is changing. We've moved from a pick a career pathway and stick with it. Again, I perhaps come back to my doctor. Maybe that's less likely. So there are the specialisms, but beyond the specialisms, don't we want the skills that allow us to just pivot when we discover new jobs that probably don't even exist yet, that we'll be looking to do in 10 years, 20 years' time?
I couldn't agree more. I think I want to pivot back to something you mentioned earlier about having a device in every learner's hands. I want to pivot back to that because I think it can be seen as quite controversial. Many people are trying to move away from technology in classrooms because they see it as a distraction. They don't believe that it's working. Whereas actually, if you look at OECD reports and PISA reports even, we are seeing that when it's done well, when it's done meaningfully, when it's done properly and effectively with the structures, actually it's hugely beneficial. And you mentioned equality. I just wondered if you would like to dig a little bit more into that.
I mean, the first thing is when we talk about digital in the hand of a child, people naturally take it as a zero-sum conversation. It's either they do or they don't have digital. And if we start by saying there are lessons where digital can be a really helpful amplifier as part of a lesson and a learning journey, and there are other lessons where it has no place whatsoever, then we're in a much more comfortable space of understanding. So we can think about the fact of, well, where are we aiming for at the end point? Well, the end point is children that are both socially literate, academically literate, and digitally literate. And digital literacy doesn't, and perhaps we take the example of AI, doesn't mean we learn how to use a tool and what it means and its risks so that we can use it every day, is that we learn and understand things so we can make purposeful decisions about when it is and isn't appropriate. And I think that's just as important for children. When we talk about a device, we think first and foremost, well, there's equity of access, assuming connectivity is part of that package, shall we say. There's equity of access to online resources, which means we're not limited by our locale or by necessarily the resources within our school. There is the consideration that depending on our learners' needs, our learners may well find that digital unlocks accessibility tools and extra support. So we might find digital resources for books where we're reading the same book as our peers, but the language is adjusted to suit our learning journey. And that's far better than saying, Al, you're still on the orange books whilst the rest of the class are on the green books. It's about everyone feeling like they're on the same academic journey. There is this sense about digital citizenship and understanding how to use technology and I love when I see schools where they have children. I was in one with Leo Academies Trust, who've done some great work around Edtech and PedTech. I'm sure they've come across your radar. Cluster of schools in southwest London. Get my east and west wrong and people won't be happy. But a great example there was they had children in EYFS. We're not using them as part of their learning each day, as you'd expect, their early years foundation day. But they had points where they were given a tablet and they were walking around to their peers saying, "Is it okay to take a photo of you? Please, may I take a photo?" And they were learning the digital etiquette, the understanding that you don't take things for granted. They were also developing the fine motor skills to actually hold a device and how to use it safely. Sounds simple, but when they get to year one, certain lessons, they were accessing resources. Then we start seeing there's a kind of, the mindset around universal design for learning and the fact that actually different learners, different technology can be different. I went to a different trust who are really focused around UDL, won a Pearson Teaching Award, folks at Woodland Academy Trust down in southeast London, and just a PE lesson and seeing learners who are actually videoing their peers and reflecting from the start and the end of the year on how they develop their movement and posture. The same way as we would traditionally do with our year 1, year 2 students, draw a picture, a face of themselves at the start and end of the year and see how they develop their motor skill and their awareness. The point of all these things is about digital is a tool. It's part of the toolkit. It's a fundamental. And when we stop making it the conversation and recognize it's just a part of the conversation, then we start to build the fact that it's part of the toolkit. It's something learners need. We have these conversations about digital and children shouldn't be looking at screens, screen time, all the other conversations. And we just need to pause and say, it's not looking at a screen. It's what you're looking at that matters. If you're engaged in something that's immersive and it's learning and it's appropriate, then absolutely. If you are a committed and focused educator or parent, you will always prefer to kick them outside and get them to go play in the fresh air, do sports, do physicality. But the truth is parents look at it from one aspect. If they spent their day in school, they'd see the school day is structured around making sure those young children are doing lots of free-form activities and forest schools and other bits and pieces at time. But I do think by the point that children get to year 4 or 5, so they're getting to that kind of point where they're 8, 9, 10-year-old children, they need to have those digital skills, digital citizenship skills, because that is the future world. Not the world their parents are used to, but the world that they're used to. And digital citizenship fundamentally builds then around that understanding of themselves, their digital footprints, how they interact with the world, how they leave behind, probably now more than ever, a need to challenge what they see and how do they validate the authenticity, echo chambers, all sorts of other bits that all feed into that. But you're right, there's an elevation of we don't need EdTech, EdTech's bad. And the first thing I pause on and say, it's really convenient if you're a government or you're a school that's short of money, let's just dismiss it. Because we tend to dismiss anything we're a bit scared of or a bit not sure about, which is the same with AI. And again, AI has some great assets, potential for education, and it has some huge risks. And we can't dismiss either side of those arguments. But I also see lots of the conversations around EdTech without understanding the word EdTech. The idea that educational technology is just this thing in the classroom, and not that it is the ecosystem of technology. Here's Al now preaching to the expert around all that interconnected digital that sits within a school system. And so when we make a cast and assertion around EdTech's bad, EdTech's evil, EdTech distracts a learner, it's like, hang on, more than half the EdTech you can't see, and it's what empowers the teachers to get things done so that they get that best quality human in the loop in the classroom with their learners, and not somebody who's just tied up in paperwork and pens and all the rest of it. This is about how do we maintain that sage on the stage and the guide on the side, and we develop. I think there's ignorance and there's fear. I don't take it as being passionate around positive use of education and technology purposefully. I don't take it as a slur when somebody says, "Oh, EdTech is bad." If somebody says EdTech is bad, they confirm to me they don't understand the conversation. Because that's like saying transport is bad. Well, there's all different kinds of transport. So do you want to be a bit more specific? But I think it's helpful to have that conversation so that we can at least hopefully upskill everybody to be better informed when they make decisions.
Wonderful. I think that's going to be a great conversation to be able to continue as well when we are all at Bett in January.
I know. Can't believe that's come round so quickly.
It really has. It's absolutely so exciting. And I can't wait to speak to you about more things. But I want to kind of end today with a little bit about your book. So I would like to know, what is your favourite awkward question? And don't tell anyone the answer because they'll have to buy the book to find out.
Okay, well, my favourite question, and I think it's because these are all things, whatever your role is in education, either within the system or as a parent from outside, I do think the most awkward question is about what is a good school.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think if you ask parents and you ask politicians and you ask system leaders, even if you ask teachers and teaching assistants, you will get different answers with different nuances that sit around that. There are other questions that are more contentious. I mean, we could have lots of conversations, couldn't we, with educators about are teachers hard done by? Is the teaching profession undervalued or overvalued? And where we are in the world and what school we're in, again, the answers will be quite different. There is a desire for politicians to be quite negative about the education sector, blame it on the leadership, because it's easier than accepting responsibility themselves for underfunding. But yeah, let's start with, what is a good school? What are you looking for in a school? What do you hold dear? And is that a different answer as time moves on, the world moves on? Maybe the answer now of a good school is different to 10 years ago because we're saying a good school is one that best equips our learners for the future. And the future's changed. So do we have to change how we equip them?
Such a great debate, isn't it? And I think it's definitely one which will continue. As you said, every single person's answer is different. And actually, in some respects, that's exactly the way it should be, because we shouldn't have every school exactly the same, and they shouldn't look the same and feel the same. They should be right for those students and children and learners in those schools.
Amen.
Al, it has been absolutely phenomenal to speak to you. I wish I had the whole day to chat away to you. I know that I absolutely could. How can people connect with you if they want to?
Well, if they really do want to get in touch and continue the conversation, best place, catch me on LinkedIn, Al Kingsley. I do have a personal blog website, alkingsley.com, where you can catch out. I'm on other socials, but I do find LinkedIn increasingly one. And my number one request would be is if you know somebody else that's doing something cool, writing cool resources or articles, or you've seen an amazing book that really got you thinking, send me a message with that information on, because that's for me is then people that I can discover and add to my newsletter for the benefit of others. And for me, that's the bit about community being, that network being greater than the node.
Absolutely. And you really are one of those champions that really supports everybody. And I know that when my journey started 10 years ago in Edtech, specifically not in education, but Edtech, it was people like you that really helped me to understand and to find those resources as well, and to understand why Edtech, what is the answer to that big question. So I do ask all listeners, if you're not following Al Kingsley already, definitely follow him and give his book a read as well. If not one of them, all of them. Thank you so much, Al. It was lovely to speak to you. See you at Bett. What I loved about this conversation with Al is that it doesn't offer easy answers. It offers better questions. From challenging what we really mean by a good school to rethinking assessment skills, digital equity, and the role of AI. Al reminds us that education systems don't change because of technology alone. They change when people are brave enough to ask awkward questions and stay curious. There is a strong thread here as well about purpose. Purpose in the curriculum, purpose in technology use, and purpose in how we prepare young people for a future that no longer fits an old industry model. If you're a school leader, policymaker, teacher, EdTech founder, or frankly anyone invested in the future of learning, this is an episode worth revisiting and sharing. You can connect with Al on LinkedIn, explore his writing, and dive into his latest book, The Awkward Questions in Education, which I would highly recommend if you enjoy a thoughtful disruption grounded in real system experience. And as always, if you've enjoyed this episode, follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with someone who's asking the same questions you are. Thanks for listening, and see many of you at Bett. If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, rate, and share the EdTech podcast wherever you're listening. It really helps us grow and reach more educators and innovators around the world. We'd also love to hear from you, your thoughts, questions, or even your own stories of change in education. You can leave us a voice note on SpeakPipe. The link is in the show notes. And we might even feature your message in an upcoming episode. And of course, you can find all our links and show notes and resources at theedtechpodcast.com.